It was a bright, sunny Saturday, and Captain Michael Harris finally had a day off to spend with his family. The local park, with its green grass, tall trees, and laughter of children, was the perfect place to relax. His 6-year-old daughter, Ava, was full of energy, running ahead of him and his wife, Emma, chasing butterflies and giggling at their unpredictable flight. Michael was proud of his little girl. She had his adventurous spirit and her mother's gentle kindness. Today was supposed to be a day to unwind, a chance to enjoy life away from the pressures of his demanding role as a police captain. Dressed in casual clothes, Michael blended in with the crowd, happy to just be a dad for the day. As Ava explored the park, Michael received a quick phone call from his office. He stepped to the side, asking Emma to keep an eye on Ava. The call didn't last long, but by the time he returned to where he had been standing, Ava was no longer in sight. His heart skipped a beat as he scanned the park, but then he spotted her near a patch of flowers, crouching down to observe something on the ground. Relieved, Michael walked toward her, but before he could get close, he noticed a police officer approaching Ava with a German shepherd on a leash. The officer's face was stern, and his tone was loud and commanding. "Hey you, what are you doing over here?" the officer barked. Ava looked up, startled. She didn't understand why the man was yelling at her. She wasn't doing anything wrong, just looking at flowers. Her small face twisted in confusion and fear as the officer continued to question her. "Don't you hear me? Answer me," he demanded, pulling the leash tighter as the dog barked loudly. The sound of the barking dog and the officer's harsh tone caught the attention of parkers, who started to gather at a distance, whispering among themselves. Ava, overwhelmed, began to cry. She didn't know what to say or do. The officer, misinterpreting her silence as defiance, raised his voice further. "If you don't answer me, I'll let the dog handle this." At that moment, Michael saw what was happening. His heart pounded as he realized his daughter was being confronted aggressively. He started running toward them, his voice booming across the park. "Hey, what do you think you're doing?" The officer turned, startled by the interruption, but before he could respond, Michael reached Ava and knelt beside her. She clung to him, crying into his chest as he shielded her from the dog. "What's going on here?" Michael demanded, his voice calm but filled with authority. The officer, oblivious to who Michael was, dismissed him with a wave of his hand. "Stay out of this, sir. I'm handling the situation." Michael's eyes narrowed. "Handling what? She's a 6-year-old girl, not a criminal. She hasn't done anything wrong." The crowd, sensing the tension, began recording the incident on their phones. Some shouted in support of Michael, while others questioned the officer's actions. Ava's tears soaked into Michael's shirt as he held her tightly. He glanced at the officer, his jaw tightening. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," Michael said quietly, his voice steady but firm. Unbeknownst to the officer, the man standing before him wasn't just an angry father. He was Captain Michael Harris, and this officer was about to learn an unforgettable lesson. The officer stared at Michael, clearly annoyed by the interruption. He tightened his grip on the leash, and the German shepherd barked louder, pulling against it. "Sir, I'm asking you to back off," the officer said firmly. "This situation doesn't concern you." Michael's eyes narrowed, his protective instincts flaring. "It absolutely concerns me," he replied, his voice calm but unyielding. "This is my daughter you're frightening, and I want to know why you're treating her like a criminal." The officer hesitated, clearly caught off guard. "Your daughter?" he repeated, his tone still defensive. He glanced down at Ava, who was clinging tightly to Michael's shirt, her small body trembling. "I saw her alone over here, and she wasn't responding to my questions. I thought—" "You thought what?" Michael interrupted, his voice cutting through the officer's excuses. "That a little girl looking at flowers was a threat. Instead of calmly talking to her, you decided to intimidate her with a barking dog." The crowd around them grew larger, murmuring in disbelief and outrage. Several people held up their phones, recording every word. One woman in the crowd called out, She's just a child. What's wrong with you? The officer's face reddened, but he doubled down. Look, I was doing my job, he said, though his voice wavered slightly. We've had reports of suspicious activity in the park. I was just being cautious. Michael stood up, keeping Eva close to his side. His height and calm authority seemed to unsettle the officer. Your job is to protect and serve, Michael said, his voice sharp. Not to harass innocent people, especially a child. And don't think for a second that I'll let this slide. The officer tried to respond, but Michael raised a hand to stop him. What's your name and badge number? He demanded. I'm going to report this. The officer's confidence faltered. He took a small step back, glancing nervously at the growing crowd. Sir, I don't think that's necessary, he stammered. Let's just. Michael's expression hardened. You don't think it's necessary, he said, his voice rising slightly. You just terrified my daughter for no reason, and now you're trying to brush it off. The tension in the air was thick, and the crowd began to voice their agreement with Michael. Another man stepped forward and said, This is unacceptable. We've been recording everything, and we'll make sure the truth comes out. The officer shifted uncomfortably, clearly realizing he was in over his head, but he still didn't know who Michael was. Sir, he said, trying to regain control of the situation, I didn't mean any harm. I was just. Michael cut him off. You were just acting on bias, he said coldly. And now you're going to face the consequences. As he spoke, another police car pulled up, and an older officer stepped out. He approached the scene quickly, his eyes scanning the situation. Michael turned to him and said, Officer, we have a problem here. Your colleague has been harassing my daughter without cause. The older officer looked at Michael, his eyes widening slightly in recognition. Captain Harris, he asked, his voice filled with surprise. Michael nodded firmly. Yes, he said, and I expect this to be handled immediately. The younger officer's face turned pale as he realized the man he had been arguing with wasn't just any concerned parent. He was the new captain of the precinct. The crowd, sensing the shift, fell silent, waiting to see what would happen next. Ava held onto her father, her tears slowly subsiding as she felt his strength and protection. The tables had turned, and the officer knew he was in trouble. But for Michael, this was about more than just his daughter. It was about accountability and respect for everyone, no matter who they were. The older officer stepped forward, his expression tense as he looked between Captain Michael Harris and the younger officer. What's going on here? He asked, though his tone suggested he already had a sense of the problem. Michael stood tall, his voice calm but filled with authority. This officer decided to intimidate my 6-year-old daughter with a barking dog, he said, keeping Ava close to him. She was simply playing in the park, and instead of assessing the situation properly, he escalated it unnecessarily. The older officer's face darkened as he turned to his younger colleague. Is this true? He asked, his voice sharp. The younger officer stammered, clearly struggling to find an excuse. I thought she was alone, and maybe up to something. I didn't mean for it to go this far. You didn't mean for it to go this far, Michael repeated, his tone incredulous. You're trained to de-escalate situations, not turn a peaceful park into a scene of chaos. My daughter was scared out of her mind, and you didn't even pause to think. The crowd around them murmured in agreement, their phones still recording. One woman shouted, This is exactly what we're tired of. Treating innocent people like they're guilty for no reason. The older officer sighed, clearly frustrated with the younger officer's actions. Captain Harris, I'm so sorry this happened, he said, his tone apologetic. We'll handle this immediately. Michael wasn't satisfied with a simple apology. This isn't just about me or my daughter, he said firmly. This is about how officers approach their duties. If it had been anyone else's child, would this officer have acted the same way? This behavior reflects poorly on all of us in uniform. The older officer nodded. You're absolutely right, Captain," he said. "I'll make sure this is addressed." Michael turned back to the younger officer, who looked thoroughly ashamed. "What's your name and badge number?" Michael asked, his tone still calm but firm. The younger officer hesitated before responding. "Officer Ryan Blake, badge number 4793. Michael made a note of it, then glanced at Ava, who had calmed down but still clung to his side. He knelt down to her level and said softly, "It's okay, sweetheart. You're safe now. Daddy's here." Ava nodded, her tear-streaked face showing relief. She wrapped her arms around his neck, and Michael hugged her tightly. For him, this was no longer just about holding one officer accountable. It was about setting an example for how things needed to change. As Michael stood, he addressed the crowd. "Thank you all for standing with us," he said. "This is why it's important to speak up when you see something wrong. We can't let moments like this go unnoticed." The crowd began to applaud, their support filling the park with a sense of unity. Michael turned back to the older officer and said, "I expect a full report on this by tomorrow. This behavior can't happen again." "Yes, Captain," the older officer replied. "You have my word." Michael walked away with Ava in his arms, Emma joining them a moment later. "You handled that perfectly," Emma said, her voice filled with pride. Michael sighed, looking at Ava, who had finally begun to smile again. "It shouldn't have happened in the first place," he said, "but I'll make sure it leads to something better." As they left the park, Michael knew this was the start of a larger conversation, a chance to not only protect his family, but also to push for real change in how officers approach their duty to serve and protect everyone equally. The next day, Michael sat in his office, reflecting on the incident at the park. The image of Ava's frightened face haunted him, and he knew that what had happened wasn't an isolated event. It was a symptom of a deeper issue, one that required immediate action. As the captain of the precinct, it was his responsibility to ensure that every officer upheld the values of respect, fairness, and integrity. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Officer Martinez, one of Michael's most trusted colleagues. "Captain, Officer Blake, and Lieutenant Parker are here to speak with you," Martinez said. Michael nodded, setting his notes aside. "Send them in." A moment later, Officer Blake and Lieutenant Parker entered the room, their expressions a mix of nervousness and anticipation. Blake, the younger officer, avoided Michael's gaze, while Parker, the older officer from the park, stood straight and composed. "Take a seat," Michael said, his voice calm but firm. As they sat down, Michael leaned forward, resting his arms on the desk. "Let's talk about what happened yesterday." Blake shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Captain, I want to start by apologizing," he said quickly. "I didn't mean to cause harm. I made a mistake, and I take full responsibility." Michael studied him for a moment, assessing his sincerity. "I appreciate your apology, Officer Blake," he said. "But an apology alone isn't enough. Your actions could have had serious consequences, not just for my daughter, but for the trust this community has in us." Blake nodded, his face pale. "I understand, sir. I was wrong." Turning to Lieutenant Parker, Michael asked, "And you? What's your assessment of the situation?" Parker cleared his throat. "Captain, Officer Blake's behavior was unacceptable. He escalated a situation that didn't require it, and he failed to recognize that he was dealing with a child. I take full responsibility for not intervening sooner." Michael's gaze softened slightly. "Thank you for acknowledging that, Lieutenant," he said. "But this isn't just about the two of you. This is about how we, as a department, approach our duties. Every decision we make reflects on the entire force." He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the bustling street below. "Our job is to protect and serve," he continued. "That means treating everyone, regardless of their age, background, or appearance, with respect and dignity. When we fail to do that, we fail the community we're sworn to serve." Turning back to face them, Michael said, "Here's what's going to happen. Officer Blake, you'll be placed on administrative leave while an internal investigation is conducted. Lieutenant Parker, I expect a full report from you by the end of the day. Blake nodded, his expression somber. Understood, Captain. Parker added, You have my word, sir. After they left, Michael sat down again, his thoughts turning to the bigger picture. This wasn't just about one officer's actions. It was about creating a culture of accountability and respect within the department. He began drafting plans for new training programs focused on de-escalation, bias awareness, and community engagement. That evening, Michael shared his plans with Emma and Ava over dinner. You're doing the right thing, Daddy, Ava said, her voice filled with pride. You're making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. Michael smiled, reaching across the table to squeeze her hand. That's the goal, sweetheart, he said. We're going to make things better, together. As the night grew quiet, Michael felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was determined to lead by example and create real, lasting change. The following morning, Michael stood at the front of the precinct's training room, facing a room full of officers. Some of them sat with curious expressions, while others looked skeptical. The tension in the air was undeniable, but Michael wasn't one to shy away from difficult conversations. Today, he planned to address the incident at the park and use it as a moment to inspire change. Good morning, everyone, he began, his voice steady but commanding. As many of you have heard, there was an incident at the park involving my daughter and one of our officers. I won't go into all the details, but I want to make something very clear. This isn't about me or my family. This is about us as a department and the way we treat the people we serve. The room grew quiet as the officers listened intently. Michael continued, Every decision we make as police officers carries weight. Our actions shape how the community sees us. When we fail to act with respect and fairness, we lose their trust. And without trust, we can't do our jobs effectively. He paused, scanning the room. The situation at the park should never have happened. But it did, and now we have a choice. We can let it pass without learning anything, or we can use it as an opportunity to grow. One officer raised his hand. Captain, what exactly are you proposing? He asked. His tone wasn't hostile, but there was a hint of doubt. Michael nodded. I'm proposing changes that will make us better. Starting immediately, we'll be implementing new training programs focused on de-escalation, implicit bias, and community engagement. These aren't just buzzwords. They're tools to help us build trust and do our jobs more effectively. Another officer spoke up, her tone thoughtful. I've been on the force for years, and I've seen how easy it is to fall into bad habits. I think this training could help us remember why we joined in the first place. Michael smiled at her words. Exactly. We all joined this profession because we wanted to make a difference. But making a difference means holding ourselves to a higher standard, even when it's difficult. He walked to the whiteboard at the front of the room, writing 3 words in bold letters. Respect, accountability, community. These are the values I want us to focus on moving forward, he said. Respect for the people we serve, accountability for our actions, and a commitment to being part of the community, not separate from it. The officers murmured among themselves, and Michael could see some of the skepticism beginning to fade. He knew change wouldn't happen overnight, but he felt a glimmer of hope that they were moving in the right direction. After the meeting, several officers approached Michael to share their thoughts. Some admitted they had been hesitant about the changes, but were now willing to give them a chance. Others thanked him for addressing an issue that had long been ignored. That evening, Michael returned home feeling a sense of accomplishment. Emma greeted him with a warm smile as Ava ran to hug him. How did it go? Emma asked. Better than I expected, Michael said, his voice filled with quiet determination. It's a start. As he sat down with his family for dinner, Michael felt a renewed sense of purpose. The work ahead would be challenging, but he knew it was necessary. For Ava, for the community, and for every person who deserved to be treated with dignity. He was determined to make a difference. The weeks that followed were some of the busiest of Michael's career. True to his word, he implemented the new training programs across the precinct, working closely with experts in community relations and de-escalation techniques. The changes weren't just about policy. They were about rebuilding the culture within the department. Michael wanted every officer to understand that their actions had consequences, not only for themselves but for the community they served. The training sessions began with small groups of officers. Michael made it a point to attend each session, sitting among the officers to show that he was not above the process. The first session focused on understanding implicit bias and how it could influence decisions without the officer even realizing it. The facilitator, a former police officer turned community advocate, shared real-life examples of how biases could escalate situations unnecessarily. One officer, Officer Jenkins, raised his hand during the session. "I'll admit, I've made snap judgments before," he said, his voice thoughtful. "I never meant harm, but now I see how it could come across differently. I want to do better." Michael nodded, proud of Jenkins's honesty. "That's the first step," he said, "acknowledging where we can improve. None of us are perfect, but we have a responsibility to try." The second session focused on de-escalation tactics. Officers participated in role-playing exercises, practicing how to defuse tense situations without resorting to aggression. Michael watched as officers initially struggled with the exercises, but gradually began to embrace the techniques. By the end of the day, many admitted that the training had given them tools they didn't realize they needed. One officer approached Michael after the session. "Captain, I'll be honest," he said. "At first, I thought this was just another training we'd sit through and forget. But this feels different. I actually feel like I'm learning something that will help me out there." Michael smiled, clapping the officer on the shoulder. "That's the goal," he said. "We're not just here to enforce laws. We're here to serve and protect. And that starts with understanding the people we're sworn to serve." Meanwhile, the community began to take notice of the changes. Word spread about the new training programs, and residents started to feel more optimistic about the department's future. Mrs. Harris, a longtime community leader, even stopped by the station one afternoon to thank Michael personally. "Captain Harris," she said, her voice warm, "I've lived here for over 40 years, and I've never seen someone take action like this. You're giving people hope." Michael shook her hand, feeling a mix of pride and responsibility. "Thank you, Mrs. Harris," he said. "It means a lot to hear that. But there's still a lot of work to do." As the weeks went on, Michael began to notice small but significant changes in the department. Officers who had once been skeptical of the new measures started to show genuine interest in building better relationships with the community. Complaints about officer misconduct began to decrease, replaced by stories of officers helping residents and resolving conflicts peacefully. At home, Ava seemed happier too. She no longer talked about being scared at the park and instead focused on her school projects and friends. One evening, as Michael tucked her into bed, she asked, "Daddy, does this mean people will always be nice now?" Michael smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "We're working on it, sweetheart," he said, "one step at a time." As he left her room and sat down with Emma, Michael felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road was long, but they were moving forward. Together, they were building a department and a community that Ava could one day be proud of. Months passed, and Michael could see the impact of the changes he had worked so hard to implement. The department felt different, not perfect, but better. Officers who had once resisted the new policies now openly embraced them, sharing stories of how the training had helped them de-escalate tense situations and connect with the community. One sunny morning, Michael walked through the neighborhood with a group of officers for a meet and greet event organized by the precinct. The idea was simple. Officers would engage directly with residents, answer questions, and listen to concerns. Michael was pleased to see smiles and handshakes replacing the suspicion that had once lingered in these interactions. As they passed a local playground, Michael spotted Ava running toward him with a wide grin. "Daddy," she called, waving excitedly. Emma followed close behind, smiling as she watched their daughter sprint to her father. Michael knelt down, catching Eva in a big hug. "What are you doing here, sweetheart?" he asked. "We're having a picnic," Eva said proudly, pointing to a blanket Emma had set up under a tree. "And Mommy said I could come say hi to you." Michael chuckled, ruffling her hair. "Well, I'm glad you did." Nearby, Mrs. Harris approached with a small group of community members. "Captain Harris," she said warmly, "I wanted to thank you for everything you've done. We've seen real change, and it's because of your leadership." Michael stood, shaking her hand. "Thank you, Mrs. Harris," he said, "but this has been a team effort, both within the department and the community. We couldn't have done it without your support." One of the officers, Officer Jenkins, joined the conversation. "It's true," he said, nodding. "The training programs have made a big difference for us. I handled a tough situation just last week, and instead of it getting out of control, I was able to talk things through and find a solution. That wouldn't have happened before." Mrs. Harris smiled, clearly impressed. "That's what we need more of," she said. "Officers who listen and care." As the event continued, Michael felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The journey had been difficult, but seeing the trust between the officers and the community slowly being rebuilt made it all worthwhile. He knew there was still more work to be done, but they were on the right path. Later that evening, Michael sat on the porch with Emma, watching the sun set over their quiet street. Eva was inside, playing with her toys and humming a cheerful tune. "You've done so much, Michael," Emma said, her voice filled with pride. "The department, the community, they're both stronger because of you." Michael leaned back in his chair, a small smile on his face. "It hasn't been easy," he admitted, "but seeing the difference we've made, it's worth every moment." Emma reached for his hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "You've shown people what real leadership looks like. You've made them believe that things can change." Michael nodded, gazing at the horizon. "It's not just about me," he said. "It's about all of us working together, supporting each other, and making sure we do what's right." As the sky turned shades of orange and pink, Michael felt a sense of peace. The challenges weren't over, but he knew he had the strength to face them. For Ava, for Emma, and for the community he served, he was determined to keep moving forward. Together, they were building a better future. A year had passed since the incident at the park, and the changes Michael had worked tirelessly to implement were now an integral part of the precinct's culture. The department had transformed from one that was often criticized to one that was becoming a model for other cities. Officers were not only better trained, but also more engaged with the community. Complaints had significantly decreased, replaced by letters of gratitude from residents who had experienced positive interactions with the police. One morning, Michael received an invitation to speak at a statewide law enforcement conference. The organizers wanted him to share how his department had made such significant improvements in such a short time. Michael felt a mix of pride and humility as he accepted the invitation. He knew the journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth every challenge. The day of the conference arrived, and Michael stood backstage, adjusting his tie. He glanced at the audience through the curtain, a mix of officers, community leaders, and policymakers. Emma and Ava sat in the front row, smiling encouragingly. Seeing them filled Michael with a renewed sense of purpose. When his name was announced, the audience erupted in applause. Michael stepped onto the stage, his heart steady as he approached the microphone. "Good morning," he began, his voice clear and strong. "I'm here today not just as a police captain, but as a father, a husband, and a member of my community." He paused, letting his words settle. "A year ago, my daughter, Ava, experienced something no child should ever face, a moment where she felt afraid of the very people who are supposed to protect her. That moment wasn't just a wake-up call for me as a father. It was a wake-up call for me as a leader." Michael went on to share the steps his department had taken: mandatory training on de-escalation and bias, creating a civilian oversight board, and prioritizing community engagement. He emphasized the importance of accountability and how it had helped rebuild trust. These changes didn't happen overnight, he said. They required commitment, teamwork, and most importantly, the willingness to listen to our officers and to our community. As he spoke, Michael noticed heads nodding in agreement. He shared stories of officers who had embraced the training and made a difference in their interactions with residents. He also highlighted the community's role in holding the department accountable and working alongside the police to create solutions. Michael concluded his speech with a message of hope. Change is possible, he said. It's not easy, and it requires effort from everyone involved. But when we come together with respect and understanding, we can build a future where trust replaces fear and where everyone feels safe and valued. The audience gave him a standing ovation as he stepped away from the podium. Ava ran up to him as he left the stage, wrapping her arms around his waist. "You were amazing, Daddy," she said, her face glowing with pride. Emma joined them, her smile wide. "You're not just changing the department," she said. "You're changing lives." As they left the conference, Michael felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The work was far from over, but they were on the right path. Together, with his family, his department, and his community, they were creating a legacy of trust, respect, and hope. For Michael, there was no greater reward than knowing he had made a difference for the people he cared about most.